Hello, and thanks so much for checking out the Coin Stories podcast. I'm Natalie Brunell, and I'm talking to the leading voices in Bitcoin about their backstories, how they discovered Bitcoin, and their philosophy on what the cryptocurrency offers. I'm honored to share my guest this week is the legendary Saifedean Ammous. Saifedean is the author of the best-selling book, The Bitcoin Standard, which offers a history of money and the central banking system, and is really the de facto book on the economics of Bitcoin and its value proposition as the hardest money ever discovered. Later this year, he'll be releasing the highly anticipated sequel, The Fiat Standard, which digs even deeper into central banks, government debt, and what Saifedean refers to as fiat debt slavery. He's running a Kickstarter for that book, which I'm going to link in the description of this video, so please support that. Saifedean is one of the most popular voices in this space, so super honored to speak with him. And without further ado, here's Saif. Okay, so Saifedean, first of all, thank you so much. It is an honor to talk to you today.
Thank you for having me on, Natalie. I'm delighted to be here.
So I want to start at the very beginning, your origin story. I think so much of how we're shaped to look at money and society starts at the very beginning with our family. So I read that you were born in Palestine. You grew up in a city called Ramallah, and as a teen, you moved to Lebanon. So take me all the way back and tell me about your upbringing.
Well, actually, it's a little bit more complicated than that. I was born in Palestine in the West Bank, but then we moved to Saudi Arabia, and then we moved to Brazil, to Rio de Janeiro, for a couple of years, and then I moved back to Jordan for a year, and then I moved to Palestine, to Ramallah, in the West Bank as well. That's where I did my high school. So I spent about 8 years there, most of my childhood. But then I went to university in Lebanon, and I did my undergraduate in the American University of Beirut. And then I moved for a year to London, where I did a master's degree. And then I moved to New York and did a PhD there at Columbia University. And then I moved back to Lebanon, and I taught there.
I mean, when you were a kid, what did your family do and how were you inspired maybe to look into economics or the idea of what money is? Did you think about that at a young age?
No, actually, as a matter of fact, I my dad is a doctor, and I was always brainwashed into being a doctor as a kid, and it was just always well known that I was going to end up being a doctor, and money and economics and all of that stuff was just not something that was interesting to us at home. We were a family of more focus on medicine. That was just where we were going. My dad would show me tapes of his surgeries that he would perform, but it had the opposite effect. It made me not interested in. So I did my undergraduate in engineering, but then in graduate studies, I decided to study development and economics, and then I got really interested in economics in graduate school, even though my PhD was based in economics, but it was about sustainable development. I became much more interested in economics, particularly Austrian economics, which wasn't really taught at my university, but I just became more and more obsessed with it.
Well, what sparked your interest in economics?
Well, I mean, I was studying it, and most of it just didn't make sense, and that was a major problem. And I just have this kind of it's a trait that is common among Bitcoiners. Pierre Rochard keeps saying, "Run the numbers." You have to run the numbers on things. You have to figure out what's actually going on, and it's a little bit of that kid who said the emperor has no clothes, and a little bit with the kind of really thorough and almost nerdy insistence on figuring out exactly how everything works. I think a lot of Bitcoiners have that, and I just happen to have that pretty much all my life. I was always getting into things quite in depth, and then while doing my PhD, I was struck by how little sense all of this stuff made, and I thought about it more and more. I thought about it hard and concluded that basically, yeah, it's an interesting topic, and it's a very interesting topic. It's one of the most interesting questions in the world because it pertains to money. Everybody uses money, and there's probably nothing else as consequential. And it's hard when you see it that way. It's pretty hard to be able to step back and think about other things more or less. it's it becomes kind of consuming, like the Bitcoin rabbit hole. Once you start, this was even before Bitcoin, but once you think about money from the Austrian perspective, once you understand how much better hard money is than easy money and the impacts that it has, I think it has, it becomes something that's quite interesting. And that's what I became very interested in.
Well, my hope is that my listeners have already read the Bitcoin Standard, but for the people out there who haven't, and they should, can you kind of briefly summarize the difference between Austrian economics and Keynesian economics, which seems to be the one that's most taught around the globe, not just in the US, as well as sort of the difference between easy money and hard money?
Yeah. The main difference between the Austrians basically, you won't hear about them much in your university. They don't get taught at universities much, but they have some major differences. The major difference, I think, is they believe in something called subjective value, so they understand that value is subjective. Based on that, it follows that the only way that economic decisions can be made in a way that is satisfactory for the people involved is if the people involved themselves are the ones who make those choices. And so it leans heavily toward a libertarian perspective, almost naturally. And it flies in the face of the idea that government is required to manage money, which makes it a bit of an issue. So it's that's, I think, the methodological main idea, or the analytic main idea. Methodologically, it's less mathematical as a result. It relies more on logic and thinking rather than doing a lot of equations. But I think perhaps functionally, the most important difference is the treatment of the topic of money. And from the Keynesian perspective, money is something that the government has to own. It only works if the government controls it. It's only natural for government to control it. And government needs to expand it at the right rate. And all of politics is about figuring out how to expand that money supply in the correct rate. The Austrians' idea is very simple but very radical and very heretic, which is money is just another good and it needs to be provided on the market. And governments have as good a reason to intervene in it as they do to intervene in the production of computers or ovens or tables or any of those things. People who want big tables will find people who make big tables, and people who want small tables will find people who make small tables. And so money, fundamentally for the Austrians, is something that needs to be discovered on the market, and something that will be discovered on the market. Is always getting discovered on the market, regardless of political authority. And of course, fundamentally, so first it's the issue that it gets discovered in the market, and then there's the issue that the supply of money doesn't have to increase. In the Austrian perspective, you don't need the supply of money to increase. If you could come up with some form of money that theoretically can't go up in supply, then that would even be better than money that increases in supply. So these are, I think, I would say, the major differences between the two.
And you're really touching on the difference between the hard money, soft money, hard
Oh,
money, or
yes, hard money. Yeah, so I think the main idea for the Austrians is sound money in the sense of the market's choice. So the Austrians won't really tell you, what money they think the market should have. They just think that the market should do it. However, analytically, if you think about what the market is going to be choosing, we've had thousands of years of records from all over the world. You can see there are things that people want in their money and there are things that people don't want in their money. It's very obvious and very logical. And the most important characteristic is hardness. People like their money to be hard because, in the sense of hard to make, so that it's not easy for others to make more of it. So Bitcoin basically is the hardest form of money that has existed. So that makes it quite interesting from the Austrian perspective, because in the market, you're naturally going to end up with the hardest money winning, just because the people who put their money on the hardest money will witness their money hold on to its value better than people who put their money in easier money, or their wealth in easier money. So over time, market value is going to accrue to people in the harder money, because the easier money loses its value. So inevitably, there's a market competitive process that leads to the harder money winning over the easier money. And of course, the only thing that can stop this is, of course, government intervention, which would step in and try and force people to use easy money. And of course, the consequences are catastrophic. Whereas from the Keynesian perspective, money should be whatever the government says it is, and the money supply should increase based on whatever equations the Federal Reserve or the central bank believes are best. And there's a council of people who meet and they make a decision and they pick a number, and that's supposed to be better than mechanical certainty.
So candidly, I didn't know the concepts of easy money versus hard money before reading your book. I didn't know the concepts of Austrian economics versus Keynesian economics. And so that's why I found so much value in your book, because this education I don't think exists in our schools. And so I want to kind of find out how you got to writing the Bitcoin Standard. But to get there, let's back up just a little bit. What were your first jobs out of school? Because I saw that you did a stint as a reporter and a TV debate show host.
Yeah, it's true. When I was in college, people do all kinds of things in college. Yeah, for a while it was like an Arabic language MTV based in Lebanon. And I did a show for a few months, but it wasn't such a big deal.
So it wasn't about economics.
No, not really. No, I wasn't into economics then.
And then you were also a football player and a coach. I just have to ask you about that.
Yeah, it's true. I like to play football. It's something that I've done for most of my life. And I had a team for a few years in Beirut where we would play almost every week.
Amazing. Okay, so what were your first jobs? I want to hear about your early career and then ultimately how you discovered Bitcoin.
Well, I finished my PhD and then I just started as a university professor in Lebanon at the Lebanese American University, and that was basically the only job that I ever had. And then after that, I left that job now, and I'm focused on doing my own thing on my own website where I teach economics and I write books, and I have a whole bunch of I have a podcast as well. So that was really my only job. I was an academic. I had a PhD and I could teach economics, and I did it for quite a while, living in Beirut, which was a beautiful place. So it was good.
So how did you discover Bitcoin and when?
Oh yeah, Bitcoin. I discovered Bitcoin. I don't even remember, honestly. I think it was 2011. I'm not entirely sure. It might be 2010. It might be 2011. I think it's probably 2011. I'm not sure, honestly. I don't even remember, because like it was just something that I heard about vaguely, and I continued to hear about vaguely and not really paying attention to. And it was very early at that time. There wasn't a lot of content about it, but I knew about it for sure by 2011.
And you read about it online, or how did you hear about it?
I'm reading about it online. I remember I met Max Kaiser and Stacy Herbert actually in 2011. They were in Beirut, and I had a friend who knew them, and we met up for dinner. I'm not sure if he told me about it that day, but that was around the time that Max Kaiser was beginning to get into Bitcoin, so he may have mentioned it. I honestly don't know my first Bitcoin story. It was just a constant noise of this weird thing popping up, and then it just grows. And but really, I only paid attention to it properly in 2013, 2014 is when I started really looking into it and studying it.
Well, I mean, what made you decide that this is something that could have legs and kind of fits with the principles of Austrian economics?
So I think I heard about it initially, and I was interested in it because it had a fixed supply. Like that was the only thing I knew. I didn't understand anything about what was going on, and there wasn't a lot of content online for you to figure out what's going on at that time. And I wasn't very interested, and I was generally kind of sympathetic but skeptical. Like, yeah, of course, government's going to shut it down. They're going to put a couple of people in jail, and they'll shut it down. And that was generally the kind of viewpoint that I had about it. I was kind of sympathetic and interested because as a gold bug, as somebody who thought gold was very interesting, and somebody who thought Austrian economics and thought about hard money, gold was the obvious choice. And then there was this little interesting thing, and obviously it's not going to work because well, because I didn't know what I was talking about, obviously. But I think because of my interest in Austrian economics and hard money and all of that, I heard about Bitcoin relatively early. But it took me quite a while until 2013, 2014 that I started to really appreciate that this is not just fantasy, and it's not just a little niche thing, and it's not just open source software project that can get a little popular with a small niche group. This actually has legs, and it could grow into a financial alternative to the monetary system that we have. And it was really 2014, 15, 16 that I started to abandon other things in my life and get down the rabbit hole. And by 2017, I decided to write a book about it, and that was the Bitcoin Standard. And yeah, published it in early 2018.
Well, tell me a little bit more about it because I mean, I've said this in a tweet that I think was very popular that I think that this should be required reading. I mean, it's a fantastic book and it doesn't just talk about Bitcoin. It's almost, I mean, the title is very interesting because most of the book is a history of money, which again, it doesn't seem like it's taught enough in schools. How does our monetary policy and economics in any country really work? So talk to me about how you came to write this book and just the research. How did you, go down that rabbit hole to put this book together and why?
I think, the research for doing this book was practically the most important thing that I've done over the last 10 years before publishing this book. So around 2007 is when I started reading Hayek and getting into Austrian economics. And then it was a long trip of 10 years of reading that as I was doing my PhD, and then as I was teaching economics, to just reading more about this and learning more about it, and reading more about hard money and these issues. And at that time, I thought I'd just put it all into one book. There was one important motivation, honestly, is I was one of those people who spent a lot of time on the internet arguing with people. And then I got married, and my wife could notice. And so she pointed out that, you're wasting too much of your time writing stupid essays on Facebook for three people when you could actually be, doing something productive with that time, writing for a larger audience. And then that just basically clicked in my head. I said, yep, no more Facebook comments. I'm going to write a book. I'm just going to put it all together. And initially, I had an idea of doing a shorter book, but as I started writing, I just started almost uncontrollably typing most of this book, and it just hit about 100,000 words, and I published it.
Do you think that Satoshi, the creator of Bitcoin, was a student of Austrian economics?
It's an interesting question, and I was just discussing it on Twitter today with a couple of people. I actually don't. I think, looking at his readings, he doesn't mention any of them, and he doesn't really seem to be influenced by this idea. In fact, if you look at his discussion of why he chose to make the monetary policy like it is, you see that it was more to do with making sure that Bitcoin's consensus parameters work, and that Bitcoin is able to remain trustless without having to rely on an authority to maintain the monetary policy. So it seems he picked the fixed cap supply because that seemed like the neatest and safest way to do that. So I think my interpretation, like, I've read pretty much everything that he's written over the years. I've gone over the archive of everything that he's written. I haven't seen a clear motivation of something that I could copy and put into my book. I've looked, if there was something there about Austrian economics, I would have definitely put it front, right, left, and center of the Bitcoin Standard. But there really isn't. And I think what I say is, I think his choices were motivated by engineering considerations rather than ideological, or at least the choices of the monetary policy. I think the monetary policy in the case of Satoshi, looking at what he said, it seems more likely to me that he was motivated by practical engineering purposes of making the system work, rather than being motivated by making the hardest money ever, or making sure that the money supply cannot Well, I think no, he had a problem with inflation, but he had a problem with fractional reserve banking. He mentioned that, but I think it was more about, like, I don't think he would have been opposed to making Bitcoin grow at 1%, perhaps, if that worked out for him. But in my mind, I think it's a testament to the correctness of Austrian economics that Austrian economics and a smart engineer arrive at the same answer because it makes a lot more sense. It really, if you were designing a monetary system, knowing everything that we know now, that everybody has spent a lot of years thinking about these questions, there's a lot more debate about this out there now that Bitcoin has been out for 12 years than there was 12 years ago when Bitcoin was not there. Knowing everything that people have said about this, if you follow this debate over time, um, it's not really. It's. I think it's not entirely clear his motivation was particularly political about it. I think it's pretty obvious that it just made more sense. Like, thinking about it now, knowing everything we know, there's just simply no reason for making the money supply increase. You want to make the supply as scarce as possible, but you don't want to make it too scarce. You make one coin and then you don't increase it, because you want to have an initial distribution. You want to have a fair way of launching the distribution. So he made the mining of the coins transparent and fair, and he made the money supply part of the consensus parameters of the network. So nobody could mine on their own. Everybody mines the same coins, and the coins are split between the miners. And so everybody is constantly keeping track of the supply. And that works out better when the supply is not inflationary. And I think it makes sense from an engineering perspective as well as from an economics perspective.
Well, what made you change your mind, since you said when you first learned about Bitcoin, you thought the government was just going to shut it down, people were going to end up in jail? What made you think that that's actually not possible? You can't shut down Bitcoin.
Well, first of all, it just refused to go away. So initially, I went through the ignorant no coiner smartass phase where, well, obviously they're going to shut it down. And you just keep waiting for it to shut down, and all you see is the price going up. So that's really, and I think everybody has to admit that at some level, that is really that's why you take a second look. If you're gotten into Bitcoin, well, not everybody, but I think for a lot of people, the assumption is that you read about it, you figure out the initial reaction is this can't work, this won't work, something's going to happen. And then, it just keeps refusing to go away. And then you start thinking about why doesn't it not go away? And you start thinking more and more about it, and you realize, okay, maybe there are good reasons for it not to go away. And yeah, that was kind of my reason. I think what really influenced me perhaps was in 2013. I think a couple of things. First of all, finding out about Bitcoin mining and Bitcoin hash rate. And 2013 was like a year after ASIC mining had become a thing. And so the amount of hash power that was dedicated for Bitcoin was enormous at that point. And so, I hadn't spent a lot of time understanding what was going on. But once, like, that bulb in my head flicked that, oh, wait, it's not just a bunch of people with their computers running a bunch of paper, running a bunch of code. They're actually using physical resources and spending a serious amount of money with large infrastructure spread out all over the world in order to make this thing happen. So that was, I think, a tipping point, and that was a point that made me revise my prior. So the price going up, the fact that the mining was such a big deal, and I was still, I still had a very simple idea about how Bitcoin worked at that time. I hadn't really looked into it. So finding out that mining continued to survive, and I think also the fact that Silk Road was shut down and yet Bitcoin survived, that was a weird one, because in my mind, this was when, all right, now they're going to shut down a big website, and then everybody's going to dump their Bitcoin, and it's going to crash to zero, and nobody wants to be holding it, and it crashes to zero, and that's the end of that. And instead, what Bitcoin did, yes, crashed for a few days, and then it shot up massively over the next few months in a way that really catches your attention. So that was when I started to really think, okay, this is worth looking into. And that's when I started reading more about it.
So, in your book, The Bitcoin Standard, you talk a lot about the gold standard as sort of the last time that we seemingly had a society based on hard money. And you talk about all the advancements that happened during that time. Are there any countries that have adopted Austrian economics and are thriving? Are there examples of countries?
Well, I wouldn't really say adopt Austrian economics because it's not, it's not, well, I guess you could say there are, yeah, there are certain ways in which you would behave. I guess, without getting too pedantic about definitions, I'd say, you look at a place like Switzerland or Hong Kong, they had some of the best examples of a free market that we've had over the last century or so. And Switzerland, in particular, was on a gold standard until the 1970s. And so the rest of the world was on a dollar gold standard, where after World War II, they were backing their currencies with dollars as well as gold, and they were essentially buying American inflation. They were importing American inflation as they are right now. But Switzerland was backing its currency with gold up until the 1970s. And that's what made it extremely attractive for money from all over the world. That's why everybody in the world wanted to have a Swiss bank account, because your Swiss bank account was backed with actual gold,
Yeah.
not government debt, which is a huge, huge difference. But then in the 1970s they went off the gold standard, and it was clearly a political issue. It was not like they discovered the benefits of going off the gold standard. And if you look at the impact, it's led to increasing inflation and increasing unemployment. In fact, in my book, you see up until the 1970s, Switzerland basically had no unemployment and no inflation. But since the 1970s, the value of the franc has declined like the rest of the fiat currencies, and it's now basically pegged to the dollar. And you see more inflation and you see more unemployment happening in Switzerland. I think Austrian economics explains why.
One of the most fascinating concepts that I learned in your books was the idea of high time preference versus low time preference. So, the idea that sound money allows you to think more about your future, which, today when we think of savings, you have to put your money into the stock market, or, you think about your 401k. You don't think about putting it in a Chase, savings account, because you're going to make no money. You're just going to lose money based on inflation. So can you kind of summarize those concepts for people that are not familiar with them, and offer an example of just how modern society is impacted by high or low time preference?
Yeah, so time preference refers to the degree to which you discount the future. So everybody's time preference is possible because positive. I'm sorry, everybody's time preference is positive because everybody prefers the present to the future. Everybody thinks of the present as being more valuable than the future, which is perfectly natural because the future is uncertain. You don't know if you're going to be here. So if I offered you the choice between a sum of money or an amount of economic value today, or the same amount of value, forgetting the units of the monetary unit, forgetting the exact number of the monetary units, I offered you the same economic value 5 years from now, you would choose to have it today because you don't know if you're going to be alive for 5 years, and you'd rather enjoy it over the next 5 years. Your time on earth is limited, and you want to enjoy things as soon as possible. So people always prefer the present because it's certain to the future, which is uncertain. And there's always a preference for the present because of this certainty. Now, as human beings, we have big, giant brains that allow us to think much more than animals. So animals are just essentially being led by their instincts, and their concerns are about the next minute, the next hour, the next day. They don't plan much longer. But we as human beings, we can lower our time preference. In other words, we discount the future less and less. So we start thinking about more and more of the future. We're not just thinking about today, we think about tomorrow. And we start thinking more about tomorrow, and a little bit more about the day after, and a little bit about next year. And then, we eventually develop the time preference where people think about, the future 50 years from now. People think about what's going to happen to my kids 50 years from now. And if you're thinking in that way, you're discounting the future much less than a person who's thinking about satisfying their needs now, only today and the next year. So as as humans discount the future more, they focus on the present more. As they discount the future less, they begin to provide for the future. And it is the lowering of time preference and the provision for the future which allows us as human beings to effectively invest for the future. It's what creates capital. It's what creates investment and allows us to you know, increase our productivity. You know, we build machines so that we can make more in the future. That requires us to sacrifice consumption today in order to invest in things that we can't consume in order to produce tomorrow. So every time you're buying capital, every time you're investing, you're giving up on consumption goods. You know, you could be, instead of buying stocks in a company, you could be taking that money and having a very fun party. You could be buying a sports car. You could be traveling. You could be doing all kinds of things with that money that satisfy you right now. But the more that you think about the future, the more you provide for the future. So the lower the time preference, the more people think of the future. And I think that's an enormously important factor in individual in individual life, in all facets of individual life, because for me it was very life changing to learn about that, because and I learned about this in Austrian economics, because Austrian economists talk a lot about this, whereas mainstream economists don't really. Learning about this was actually really almost life changing, because you think about it and you see that it affects every facet of your life. Do you think about the present, or do you think about the future? How much do you think about the future? How much do you discount the future when you're taking decisions about what you want to do now? And you see that it reflects across many different facets. You know, when you act in a way that discounts the future heavily, you find yourself in the long run running into a lot of problems caused by that behavior. So if you spend a lot on today rather than saving for the future, then you find yourself in financial trouble in the future. And it's similar in all manner of things, in all aspects of life, in health as well, in personal relationships, in all aspects of life. I think if you if you prioritize the present, you sacrifice the future. And the more that you sacrifice on the present, the more you're able to prioritize the future, the more you're able to provide for the future. So I think one point that I drive home in the Bitcoin Standard, in my next book, the Fiat Standard, as well as my next book, which comes after it, which is Principles of Economics, one point that I like to drive home is that the hardness of money is a major factor in the time preference of people, because the harder the money that you use, the less the uncertainty about the future. And so the less the uncertainty about the future, the less you discount the future. So you start thinking about the future more. And so the way that I see it is, if you look at the 20th century, we've moved from gold to fiat, which is easy money. We've moved from hard money to easy money. And that move from hard money to easy money has led to the world basically raising its time preference. And you see it in everything. You see the world, people save much less than they used to. People are in much more debt. People are in all aspects of things. You can see it reflected in all manner of decision. You can see it in art. You can see it in music. You can see it in the family. People invest less in things that last for long, and spend a lot on fleeting things that don't last for a lot of time. So I think one interesting facet of Bitcoin, which I think a lot of Bitcoiners agree with, and this is why I think this concept of time preference has become extremely popular, I think, among Bitcoiners. I think it's because it hit a nerve. I really didn't expect it to hit that much of a nerve. It was, I was still an academic when I was writing this book, and it's an academic book. So I was talking about this stuff, not expecting it to make such a popular reaction. But I think a lot of people liked that concept, because I think there's a lot of truth to it. And they could see the difference as soon as they had Bitcoin, because once you moved to having Bitcoin, you found, for the first time in your life, for our generation, I think, for the first time in our life, we found a reliable way of increasing value into the future. Sure, there are stocks and bonds and real estate before, but that stuff is pretty difficult to understand and requires constant management and supervision, and that's basically another job. So you had to, the problem with fiat money is that you need two jobs for it. You need to
Yeah.
earn it with one job, and then you need another job where you're maintaining it, where you're earning it again on the market every day by betting correctly on where to place it. So, hard money fixes that. Hard money, you earn the money and it just stays earned, because nobody can debase it. It stores the value, and it doesn't matter, because it doesn't matter how many people print whatever they want to print, because nobody has a printer that can make your hard money. That's how gold worked, and that's how Bitcoin works. So, I think, um, yeah, I think Bitcoin has been the example that I was mentioning is with a lot of Bitcoiners, they've experienced this personally in that as soon as they started to use Bitcoin and started to see how much it can appreciate and how easy, well, not easy, but I'd say how reliably it is to send, how reliable it is to send value to your future self. Suddenly, you start valuing your future self more. You start thinking about yourself more. You start essentially maturing and you start lowering your time preference. So an enormous number of Bitcoiners talk about, knowing Bitcoin and quitting alcohol and quitting drugs or getting married or having kids. It just, it seriously switches people's perspective toward thinking about the long term because you can provide for the long term. Whereas before Bitcoin, you had no reliable way of knowing how you could have wealth in 5 years. You either had to spend 5 years, either managing your house to make it store value, which is still, it's not going to make a lot of money, or managing stocks, which is another job. But more likely, you just did what everybody did, which is live off credit and continue to have to earn enough money to always be able to take on credit if you need it rather than accumulate savings. And that's just a way that makes you discount the future heavily because the future involves, you future you paying back paying back for the sins of present you. Whereas if you're saving, future you will benefit from present you, and so you have something to look forward to. So you think more about the future, and I think I think we're only going to see this amplify more and more over time as more Bitcoiners experience it.
Yeah, well, I think we're discounting the future so much now during the pandemic with all the stimulus. And so I'm curious to get your thoughts on the response to the pandemic because so many businesses were forced to shut down and then the money printer accelerated. It didn't start, right? We've had quantitative easing, but it accelerated in response to the stock market crash and everyone out of work. So if you were president or if you were the head of the Fed, what would your response have been?
Well, I guess I just wouldn't get wouldn't get to that position. I'm pretty sure I'm never going to find myself in that kind of position in the first place. That's what I would do. Really, just make sure that I never find myself having to make such a decision. Because really, where do you start from? It's been a century and 7 years of bad turns being taken by a lot of people on this question of how to deal with money and how to manage money. So there are no easy answers for what to do right now. I guess there is one easy answer, which is my easy answer, which is just Bitcoin. And I think it seems to be continuing to be it seems to continue to prove itself as a workable answer for individuals and organizations, and now we're seeing governments come in as well. So I think it makes sense for perhaps for governments to start considering putting their money into Bitcoin rather than continuing to print more and more of their money and start thinking more of the long term. But I'm skeptical. I was very surprised that El Salvador acted like this. I thought governments are going to be much more high time preference about it and not see the benefit of Bitcoin. But El Salvador has moved very quickly, so it'll be very interesting to see how that develops.
Well, we know that central bank interfering with the free market causes these booms and bust cycles. And I think everyone's gotten accustomed to, there's a boom and then there's a recession, and no one thinks that that's problematic. The pandemic caused this sort of spontaneous bust, I would say. And now for over a year, we've seen a huge boom with unprecedented money printing. It almost seems like this final fiat orgy, and everyone who has no finance background thinks it's going great, but we're actually really hanging off a cliff. So when is the next bust and how big will it be? Because I know there's people that are predicting a historic crash, far worse than we saw last March, that will really come, it'll take the economies around the world crashing down.
I honestly don't know. I've upgraded from the fiat markets and I don't follow them closely. I think it's a pretty difficult thing to predict fiat markets accurately. I think so, the people who follow the credit cycle and the money supply seem to be, and from the Austrian perspective, it would make sense that that would be the best way to figure it out because the majority of money creation is taken care. The majority of money creation takes place in the credit markets. And so finding out what's happening with the credit markets, if the credit markets are expanding, then it's party time. Whereas if the credit market starts shrinking, then it's going to be pretty nasty. And I think another way to tell is the yield curve. Generally, whenever we've had the yield curve invert, it's always led to a recession afterwards. And it seems to make sense from the Austrian perspective that this would be the case, because it's you're artificially manipulating long-term interest rates more than short-term interest rates, and so at the final stage, the yields would flip. But the honest answer is that I think it's insane for people to be following this. Like it's like I used to watch a bad TV series and I quit it, and I'm trying to get my friends to quit it now. This is what it feels like with fiat. It's amazing to think how many smart people are hanging on every word of the central bank. And pretty much if you've had any money in the markets, you had to do that. You've had to spend the last 10, 12 years paying attention to what's going on, or paying people to do that for you, or most likely both. And, it's astounding for me that we still do that, because we don't need all of this primitive medieval technology of councils of elders meeting together and deciding what the right number is. We have algorithms, and we have computers, and we have machines, and we have miners that can do this job so much more efficiently with beautiful mechanical and electric efficiency and reliability. So there's really no reason for us to continue to be using these things. And there's no reason for people to just be gambling their life savings. This is the sad thing about it, really, that it's not just like a sports or a TV series that you're following. It's extremely consequential, because you have your entire life savings riding on this, depending on this. What are we going to be doing with what people are going to be doing with their life savings depends ultimately on how they follow those markets. And I think, Bitcoin has its volatility and it has its craziness. But overall, I think if you have a time horizon of more than 3, 4, 5 years, then it's a no-brainer. Bitcoin, you need to figure it out once and figure it out, and it just sits there. And you don't need to actively manage it. And over time, I think it outperforms pretty much everything because of its scarcity. So I think, hopefully, in a Bitcoin world, the majority of people would have this basically safety net of money that is strong, that is hard, that can't be debased, and they'll store most of their wealth in that, and they'll use that as their store of value. And people will have investments. People will still invest. I think there's still room for investment, and people will still do that. But you'll be able to have a part of your wealth that is risk-free, and that's what money is supposed to be. And I think, with everything that Bitcoin is going through, it's proving itself in the long term that it's going to be the risk-free asset, more or less. This is how I think about it, because it's in the long term, everybody's going to start thinking about the opportunity cost of everything in terms of Bitcoin. And that's really the path. I think it occurs to me now, I think, the difference between no coiners and Bitcoiners is ultimately the Bitcoiners, when they found out about Bitcoin, they had some conception of opportunity cost, where the more number go up, the more they started thinking of opportunity cost. But I think if you don't understand the opportunity cost, which many people don't, particularly fiat people, because they live in a world in which opportunity cost doesn't exist, because government just prints more money whenever it needs anything. If you have that kind of mentality, then you don't really see the opportunity cost of you missing out on this and being a hater. How expensive it's really been. You think about just how much people who have hated on this technology have had to pay over the years because of just how well it's done.
Well, it's interesting what you say, because so many people view Bitcoin as gambling. People who don't really understand it, haven't taken the time to look into it. They see the stock market and real estate as the safe bet, and they see Bitcoin as, look, it just dropped 40%. I would be down. I could have put my money into a standard bank account and made more. So how do we bridge that gap? Because I think on a mainstream level, so many people still don't get it. How do we get people to understand it?
I think ultimately what's going to get them to understand it is number go up technology, as Bitcoiners like to call it. It's just the price going up is going to attract the attention. I'm just being realistic here. It would be nice to perhaps have other answers for this, but like honestly, that's really that's Bitcoin's marketing. It's the fact that it offers anybody in the world the chance to hold on to savings that appreciate with time is I think there's no way you can underestimate that. There's no reason to just think, oh well, that's not a big deal. This is the biggest market in the world by far. It's about the same size of all the other markets. It's the market for storing value. There's about 360, 400 trillion dollars of value that people want to save in instruments that they're looking for because they're not risky. So if you think about cash, saving accounts, and treasury bonds, all of that adds up to a couple of $100 trillion. So the fact that Bitcoin can do that job, the fact that Bitcoin is in that market, it's still a very, very tiny chunk of that market. It's what, 0.2% at this point of the total store of value market demand, perhaps. The fact that it's in the game is astonishing because if it grows, there's enormous upside potential, and the only way that can get resolved, the only way that can happen, is if the price goes up, because there's no way of making more Bitcoins to give to people. They're just going to have to pay higher and higher prices, and that's how the network works. That's how it stays secure, and that's how it's essentially a perfectly honest and transparent system. Everybody in the history of Bitcoin has had to work for their Bitcoin or buy them at the market price. Nobody got favors. Nobody in the history of Bitcoin managed to get any discounted coins. There's no favoritism to anybody. So it's a perfectly fair system. And it functions through basically rewarding people who get into it. So I think that's ultimately what's going to happen. I think more and more people are just going to listen to it. And of course, I think, when people talk about, the first part of your question, when people talk about stocks and bonds, these things worked to beat inflation probably. But I think most people, if you look at inflation numbers, these things have beaten them. But if you look at inflation numbers as measured with the expensive things that actually people really do want, people want to live in nice houses, not just any houses. People want to go to good universities, not just any universities. People want to eat good food, not just any food. If you look at prices for that, and then you compare to the bonds and stocks and the real estate, it hasn't done that well. And it hasn't done very well considering, I think the most important thing that people miss is that if we'd had a money supply that was constant, prices would have been declining much more. So the fact that prices aren't rising much isn't good. It's not good enough. Prices could be dropping much more, and things would be much more affordable, and people would have much more security in their future, and they'd be able to hold savings that appreciate, and also to see the prices of things decline over time. This would make people much more secure. So I think what's happening is over time, the degree of inflationism in the system has been increasing, and the pretense that this is keeping up is becoming harder to maintain. People are realizing now you basically need to be making 20, 25% in order to be beating inflation. And that's not very easy to do, when you count fees. And especially, I think the important thing to think about is to think about the cost of the management. Your time spent on figuring out how to get the 20, 25, 30%, even if you do get it, that's a lot of time, and it's going to cost serious money if you calculate it. And so it's very hard to continue to beat the market when the market is leaking, essentially, or when your money is leaking or value all the time. It's very hard to continue to be able to beat the market in real terms. Whereas Bitcoin has been effortlessly putting in 200% a year over the last decade. So we'll see.
I want to dig into that a little bit because I think that a lot of people today, at least in America, they realize that something's wrong. I mean, the political division, I think, is an example of a lot of people feeling like the system is rigged and finally wanting to stand up and do something about it. But I don't know if you've noticed this, but capitalism seems to be blamed for a lot of it. That's the reason we have this massive, income inequality. And one of the things I know you talked about in the Bitcoin standard is this concept of foreign imports and investments. So you say in the Bitcoin standard that under Keynesian economics, foreigners are subsidized to come buy a country at a discount. And I think a lot of people have seen that, or they feel that. I heard so many people refer to the process as really the problem with capitalism, because it costs less to produce something somewhere else. So the companies are going outside and it's destroying America. Is that capitalism? And do you feel like we need to reteach capitalism?
I think essentially the problem in the popular understanding is that people blame capitalism for what Fiat did. What they think of as capitalism is massively disfigured because of the fact that the monetary system is not a free market, and this is the kind of this is why the Austrians are such Debbie Downers and party poopers, because they're always telling everybody, all of your assumptions are wrong. Um, uh, the capitalist economic system, in order for it to function, it functions based on the ability of people to perform economic calculation. Individuals, sellers, buyers, producers, they're all able to think in terms of prices for inputs and outputs and how they relate to consumer demand and supply and what they tell us. This is the coordinating mechanism. This is the code that makes the computer run, and these are the signals that are that make economic activity work. If this was a car, these would be the eyes that allow the person to see what's in front of them in order to drive. So when the central bank is in charge of the monetary policy, the central bank is in charge, is able to affect every single economic transaction taking place in the economy, and which is a very big deal. And it results in the central bank's ability to very effectively manipulate economic activity in society by making it more and more headed toward the interests of the government and the interests of the banks and the central banks. It gives them an extremely disproportionate level of power over the rest of the world, over the people, over the peasants like us who don't have our own money printer. So this system is unsustainable under a capitalist system, or capitalism is unsustainable with a money like that. The more the government messes with the money, the less of a capitalist economy you have, because you're knocking down the roots of this. It's like you're eating at the roots of the capitalist tree when you're destroying the ability of individuals to calculate by destroying the currency. So a lot, I would say all economic problems, people have made fun of me for blaming everything on fiat, but I have owned this because you can actually blame everything on fiat. In fact, I will gladly admit that the summary of my next book, I'm gonna, spoiler alert, if you don't want to ruin the book, don't listen for the next few sentences. But basically, the fiat standard, all that it says is everything I hate is fiat and fixed by Bitcoin, is caused by fiat and fixed by Bitcoin. I fully confess to this, but it's easy to laugh at it. It's much harder to refute it, I think. It's much harder to make the contention that messing with the money supply will just not have implications on all the aspects of society. Each one of us uses money to perform economic calculation tens of times every day. And if you mess with that, of course, you're going to make everything suffer. And it's a question of understanding how the fiat causes the dysfunction and what kind of dysfunction comes about, rather than whether there is dysfunction or not, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, I find it so fascinating because capitalism, at least lately, is so demonized. And you mentioned in the Bitcoin standard, even the notion of like these larger firms that can secure loans much easier than a small mom and pop shop, which leads to this, mass industries, mass production, corporatization in America. And again, people are blaming that on capitalism, but you almost say that capitalism would fix that.
Precisely. I think one line that I have in my book is that debt-fueled mass consumption is as much a part of normal part of capitalism as asphyxiation is a normal part of respiration. The process of respiration is the exact opposite of asphyxiation, and mass consumption with debt is the same thing for capitalism, because capitalism, the word capital refers to is physical stuff, or not necessarily physical stuff, but stuff that you use in order to produce economic goods. And so, as I was saying earlier, all of that stuff necessarily has a real opportunity cost in terms of economic goods. You could turn that stuff into food and parties, and you could have an amazing day today. Everybody who owns capital in the world, I think this is, to understand why there's value to capital. Every single person who owns capital on the planet could sell it and consume it and have an awesome day today. Their day could be much better off. If there's a person who owns something that's worth $100 million, they could throw the most amazing party with those $100 million today. And yet every day they wake up and they don't throw that party and they don't spend the $100 million. And that's what capitalism is about. It's because they keep prioritizing the future and they keep thinking about the future. And that is how capital is accumulated. Without thinking of the future, you can't accumulate capital. Without saving, without having an excess, you can't produce, you can't accumulate capital. But when you get into debt, you're doing the opposite. When you get into debt, you're consuming the capital that you have and you're reducing your ability to be productive. So I think the reason people get into debt in the fiat system when their grandparents didn't under a gold standard, and also, you look at Switzerland, it had the highest saving rates in Europe as well because it was the last one on the gold standard. The reason people get into debt right now is that money doesn't work as a store of value. In fact, the best way to store value, I used to think, when I was a gold bug, I used to think that the best way to store value in the fiat system would be gold. But I realized there's a better way to store value in fiat, which is to short fiat. Going short fiat is the store of value play. The problem with it is that financially it makes sense if it works out, but there's a very high risk involved. And that risk is why everybody's uncertain. So everybody has to go short fiat or else they're paying a very heavy price. If you try and buy a house from cash, you're going to be effectively paying much more than the person who's paying for that house with installments, because they're paying with devalued fiat in the future. So the best thing to do is to have liabilities denominated in fiat. That has outperformed pretty much anything in the fiat world. Now, of course, Bitcoin, I think, is beats that. So I think if we lived in a world in which the money was hard, people would just hold the money and they would think of the future. And then this part of your life that requires constant management of the money would just be spent doing useful things, playing with the kids and cooking and boating and climbing mountains, and you'd have peace. You'd be able to think about the future.
Well, I think this is a good place to segue to the Fiat Standard. That's your new book. So many fascinating things about it. And I think if people want to really learn about how the government debt system works, fractional reserve banking, all of that, I think people need to read this book to really understand what's happening when the government says they're going to print money or they're writing these checks. So one of the things I just first want to ask you is why did you decide to write that book? Like, why wasn't the Bitcoin Standard enough? And what made you decide what to actually put in it?
What made me really think of this book, I'd written a bunch of essays after I wrote the Bitcoin Standard, and I was continuing to write about the things that I didn't have space to talk about in Bitcoin, and the ideas that I was getting as Bitcoin was continuing to move along. And then there's a good friend of mine called Giacomo Zucco, who is on Twitter, one of the hardcore Bitcoiners. At the Baltic Honey Badger conference in Riga in Latvia in 2019, back when life was normal, September 2019, I was at that conference, and Giacomo, who's one of the most notorious toxic maximalist Bitcoiners, in that he is no friend of altcoins, if we can call them by their polite names. But during that day, Giacomo was presenting a paper saying, if you wanted to make a case for altcoins, what is the best case that could be made for altcoin? And as I was already beginning to think more and more about the debt fiat system, because I didn't discuss debt in the Bitcoin Standard because it was, the book was enough. And talking about the fiat debt system, I discussed it briefly, but I didn't get into the implications of the fact, how does Bitcoin grow in a world in which everybody is in debt? What is happening between this force of people who want to save and the majority that wants to get into debt? How is that going to play out? So that was part of the writings that I was doing after I wrote the Bitcoin Standard. And the presentation by Giacomo made me start to think that this would be a useful way of approaching this question, because it would make me this would be a good way of thinking of fiat, because then it would allow me to answer the question of how Bitcoin deals with fiat by first studying fiat. And then I took this a step further and decided, all right, I'm going to write this book like the Bitcoin Standard in the same way. I'm going to be, when I wrote the Bitcoin Standard, it was 2017, very few people knew what was going on with Bitcoin. And my concern was, I need to write a book in 100,000 words and give it to somebody that can read it in about 10 to 12 hours, and they'll finish it and come up with a good idea about what's going on with Bitcoin. So it required a lot of systematic engineering-like thinking to, what is it that I want to talk about? There's no known methodology for writing books about Bitcoin, and nobody had drawn up the rule book, because such a thing is very new. So what do you write about? In my mind, I studied engineering, and so that helped me have the kind of functional engineering perspective on it, to study the question from a functional perspective of, what people need to know is how this thing works. Let's think about how it works, and then, what function it performs. That will provide people with the best understanding. Instead, if you're going to explain a car, instead of getting into the details of what's under the hood, explain the function of transportation and then the propulsion that makes it possible. So with Bitcoin, that was the approach that I took. And with the fiat standard, I decided I'm going to do the same thing with fiat. I'm going to, I'm familiar with fiat, but I'm going to think from first principles. And the good thing about the Bitcoin book is that the Bitcoin book gave me a solid foundation for thinking about what a monetary system would look like. Because Bitcoin is software. So software has no space for, sentimental bullshit. It's going to just perform, it's a finely tuned machine. And obviously the fiat monetary system is not. It's got a lot of romance and propaganda attached to it. So, but Bitcoin offers us basically a blueprint for thinking about a monetary system, because it offers us the minimum viable product global monetary system. You have somebody who makes the supply, and you have a way of keeping track of the supply, and you have a ledger of accounts. And so you are able, once you know what the functional core is, you can strip out all the other stuff and focus on how the functional core operates. And once you've established that operation, then you think about the implications of it. So that's what the fiat standard does. So we study how fiat works, how fiat mining works. And the key insight that motivates the book is the idea that fiat mining is debt. Lending is how you mine fiat. And so in gold, people dig holes and take out sand and then put it in all kinds of complicated processing, and they come out with gold nuggets from it. In Bitcoin, miners perform proof of work calculations, and they come out with Bitcoins from it. In fiat, banks make loans, and that's how money is created. That's where money comes from. The bank is making a loan, and new money is coming into the economic system. So what is the implication of that? Well, the implication of that is that everybody's going to want to try to be a lender. So think about the implications of that, and everybody's going to want to try and be in debt. So you think about the implications of that on time preference, on financial security, on all kind of aspects of life. And there's a lot there to talk about. And there's a lot I'm going to be talking about after the book, because there was no room for it in the book. So there's going to be more and more. Um, and so that helps us understand how fiat functions and how fiat dysfunctions, and then helps us understand how Bitcoin rises in all of this.
I think it's such a fascinating book. I mean, everything from how you even talk about how fiat influenced architecture. But I want to focus on two chapters that really stood out to me, the chapters on fiat and family and fiat and food. So let's start with the family. You sort of posit in your new book that fiat has contributed to sort of the erosion of the family structure, which has so many consequences in society, including, the necessity for a two-income household. And more, even that is not enough. People are still in debt and very stressed out, and working, more than 40 hours a week. So I find this interesting because I'm a millennial. So many millennial women feel their pursuit of money and career, among other things, is their liberation. It's progressive, it's freeing. Courtship, I would say, has completely changed. Some of my girlfriends don't want men to pay for them. They feel uncomfortable with acts of chivalry. Do you think the fiat standard brought about this transformation, and what would family look like under the Bitcoin standard?
Well, I don't think it's the only thing, obviously. I think, for instance, the advancement of technology was an enormous one, which, and an important thing that it did is that it made work less about brute force, and therefore made women much more capable of competing with men in the workforce. And I think, people like to hate a lot on fossil fuels for all kinds of reasons, but nothing has liberated more women than fossil fuels, because when we didn't have fossil fuels, all of our lives were about grunt work. Men and women, we had to spend all of our day, unless you were one of the very few very rich people in the world who had slaves, you generally had to spend all of your day working hard for yourself and moving your stuff around. And everything required a lot of work. You had to collect firewood, and you had to cook, and you had to hunt. And so generally, for all of human history, physical labor was enormously important for our survival. And what energy has done is allow us all these amazing, beautiful, wonderful slaves in the form of machines that you just click buttons and they do the things that you want to do. You don't have to walk 6 miles. You just get into a car and you barely do anything, and you get there. You don't have to go and collect wood. You've got gas connected into your apartment, and you can cook. So and as a result of that, jobs themselves went from being grunt work to being more intellectual, which allows women much more of a chance to be in the workplace. So I wouldn't say it's only fiat, and I think also contraception and sexual liberation is also a big part of it. But I also think fiat is a big part of it anyway, still a big part of it. And ultimately, I think the rise in time preference that happens as people start to as the financial aspect of their life starts to take on a more of a higher time preference aspect. And so they start discounting the future more financially. They start discounting the future more in all kinds of ways. And I think that ends up leading to less willingness to invest and less investment in long-term projects and in a family. And so you see this, from the family shrinking first. So people start having fewer kids, and then people start not marrying as much. And you see it in the development, I think, of more transient relationships, which is happy and rewarding in the short term rather than in the long term. And so I think I think the rise in time preference is a part of it, because people don't feel like they can provide for their future self. And I think if you look at places that suffer from hyperinflation, where the future is much more uncertain, you suddenly have a very high discount rate on the future. In that kind of situation, people begin to behave in very short-termist and counterproductive ways. And I think that reflects in all manner of decisions. And when inflation is not at the hyperinflation level, when it's just at the constant low boil level, then you're getting that at a lower pace. But I think it accumulates over time, and over time people just discount the future more and so focus more on their present. And I think uh, another aspect of it, of course, is that the family can't financially provide for itself, and the state provides of a lot of the functions of the family, and that's facilitated by fiat. The reason we can have a nanny state, and the reason that the state is expected to be there when you're sick, and when you're hungry, and when you're tired, and when you're old, and when you're want to get educated. The reason the state can do all of those things, the reason it can promise all of those things, is because it's devaluing your money. So joke's on you, obviously. But the reason they get the legitimacy for it is because people think that it's for their own good. But the result of it is that the incentive to invest in the family is reduced. There's less of an incentive to want to have somebody next to you in 50 years, because you think, well, in 50 years, uh, government is going to be there, and the children have less of an incentive to care for their parents because the government can care for them, the government will care for the children. So it kind of breaks the family bonds. The growth of the state, the ability of the state to control wealth, rather than the family being the way in which we manage wealth, because traditionally, wealth only survives in families, more or less. People pass their wealth down generation after generation, if they do, and that's how human wealth generally survives. And now, by taking that away from families, because it makes inflation very high, government is essentially taking that over.
I just find that so fascinating because really I see so many people saying, I'm freed from the bounds of traditional society. I don't have to have kids. I can do this or that. And it just almost seems like the fiat system is encouraging that, because how else would you survive? I mean, family is so expensive to have. You're almost discouraged to, have it because of things like the cost of college, the cost of having a home. And you talk about how that sort of, in terms of time preference, it also gives us more meaning and fulfillment when we do have a family and we have a solid family structure where there are parents that are around and they care. I mean, don't you think that influences a lot of things in society?
For sure, yeah. I do, absolutely.
So I want to talk about the other chapter, which is fiat and food. Why do you think it's so hard for people to believe that agencies like, the FDA or the USDA, who put out backwards food pyramids, that they might not have their best interest at heart, that money is really guiding a lot of the decisions? Stores are full of things that are making us fat, and no one really accepts or believes that anymore.
Well, because, junkies always have their reasons. um, that's the ugly reality of it. It's not the very popular answer, but it really comes down to it. I think when you're arguing, very smart people suddenly become very dumb when you're talking to them about their drugs. And junk food is a drug. It is a terrifying drug. It's a destructive drug. I encourage you to quit it first, and then you'll see how powerful it is as a drug. In fact, I I've joked on my podcast before, like if you're out with a group of people and they're all drunk and you're the only one who's sober, you can tell what alcohol does. You can see the impact of alcohol, and you can see like your friend is acting extremely different because they're drunk, and that's not your friend. That's the alcohol talking. And in a sense, once you quit junk food, you also see that with people. I think people are to a very large degree the junk food that they eat talking. I think the impact that it has on people is enormous. It causes mood swings, and it causes attachment, and it causes them their energy levels to rise and crash. And at a very subconscious level, they don't even need to be aware of it. At a very subconscious level, they just their defense mechanisms flare up when the possibility that their drug of choice is not good for them becomes out there. And when that possibility is out there, immediately they become defensive and reactive and not receptive to it. So it's not a very popular message to spread around, but I've I have a thing for unpopular messages that nobody wants to hear, but that's my that's my niche. So and I think it's extremely related to fiat. I think it's no coincidence that these things headed in this direction where people went, and government started taking more and more authority in food, Part of it is to hide food inflation because food prices are rising, and you want to make sure that food prices don't rise too much. And the way to make sure that it doesn't rise too much is to tell people that they shouldn't eat the real food whose price rises, and that they should instead eat the industrial waste that is very cheap and very easy to scale because it contains no natural nutrients, very little natural nutrients. And so I think it's no coincidence, and then you can see it, it's very well documented how the Department of Agriculture drove industrial farming and encouraged farmers to get bigger and gave loans to all the big farmers and drove out all the small farmers. This was all fiat inflicted. And the food guidelines are all fiat inflicted. And the result of it, I call it in my book, is a complete shift of the dietary Overton window. I think people today, what they consider food is just extremely different from what their grandparents and great grandparents considered to be food 100 years ago. It's just an entirely different, an entirely different perspective on the thing. We've moved enormously from it, and the industrialization has been enormously profitable for the corporations that benefit from it and that pay to promote it. But it has been disastrous for the people who eat it.
Yeah, we see obesity going up. I thought the chapter that you wrote on that was so fascinating because I don't know if it's that I'm from Europe, but my family has always been very skeptical of what's been in processed foods in America. They were always like, don't eat that. My friends would be eating like, low fat or whatever the trend was, low fat, low sugar, whatever. And my parents were like, no, just eat real food, and you need, animal fats and this and that. And it was completely different than all the families that we were around when we immigrated to the US. I want to start to wrap up and touch on a couple of other big things that are in both of your books. The first one being liberalism. What is the difference between liberalism and liberality, and how have we sort of transitioned in this country?
Yeah, I take this from Jack Barzoon, who wrote a great book called From Dawn to Decadence. And in that book, he talks about how, and he marks 1914 as the turning point, as the beginning of the age of decadence in the West. He doesn't mention money, he doesn't mention fiat, and it's an entirely cultural thing. And it's astonishing. It's astonishing for me that art and culture took that turn exactly at that same time. And this is one of the foremost critics of art in the world. He died recently at the age of 102, and he was still active until he was like 102 or so. Maybe I might be misremembering. It's around 102, but he was pretty out there. He was pretty old. So I think the key concept is that I think the key difference between the two is responsibility. Liberalism was the idea that individuals would have the freedom to do what they want, and they would have the responsibility of bearing the consequence of it. And in the 20th century, Barzoon says liberalism to liberality. This was the shift from liberalism to liberality. And liberality is just you do what you want and you expect the universe, or basically the government, to take care of you. And that was really the mentality of the 20th century. It was the mentality of people getting out in the street or writing newspaper articles or going on TV and the radio and demanding other people do things for them. It's just that's what politics is in the 20th century. And that's what the printer press unleashes. If the government can just make money out of nowhere, then every instance of a person needing money on the government's soil is a policy choice. So is there a starving mom somewhere? That's a government choice to keep her starving, because they could just print the $500 that would make her happy for this month. Is there somebody whose business is not working? Well, that's a government choice to let his business fail. They could save his business and all his workers and all his family if they just print that money, and it's a choice that they don't do it. So everybody's constantly fighting over who gets to control the money magic printer. And in that sense, the only thing that works is the concept of I want, and nothing in politics works when somebody mentions the opportunity cost. That's the way to fail in politics. It's the equivalent of no, I don't know what else. I think that's really the worst thing that you can do as a politician. I'm trying to think of something else, but politicians get away with everything these days. There's nothing. The only thing that they can't get away with is opportunity cost. Telling people that there's a cost to what they want is the one
Right.
cardinal political sin. And everybody comes at it, I think, and I think it culturally inflicts everything. I think it's amazing how many people feel entitled to things, and you see it everywhere at all times. People just think that I'm offended or I demand, and then the world needs to rearrange itself because you don't like the way that things are. And I think Bitcoin is amazing for this because Bitcoin is just a powerful, unmoving, endless rocky shore on which to crash the fragile boats of egos that demand things and expect them and don't believe in the concept of responsibility because nobody can print Bitcoin for you, and you can keep shouting until you're blue in the face. Next block is coming, and if you don't have sats on it, you're not going to get them. They don't take shouting. They don't take indignation. They don't take self-righteousness in the Bitcoins. They only take economic value, real economic value that Bitcoin holders are willing to pay for, or electricity for the miners.
Yeah, no, I would argue that you're right. You have to become a victim under the current system because that's how you access the fiat benefits. And I'm going to take that one step further. It seems like millennials and younger generations have sort of been split down the middle. Half of them are increasingly socialist. They want more government intervention. And the other half are sort of the capitalists and the Bitcoiners. But it doesn't seem like these two ideologies can coexist. So how do you see it ending?
Honestly, the way that I think it'll end is just brutal economic reality is going to impose itself. People who don't believe in Bitcoin aren't going to end up spending a lot of time, money, and energy and effort going into broken monetary system and a broken financial system. And in the long run, the expected return on that in real terms is arguably going to vastly underperform the expected return of Bitcoin. And I think that's going to be the it's brash and it's gauche if you want it. It sounds so wrong for an economist to be talking about it, but that's ultimately what it comes down to. That's economic reality. Bitcoin number go up, and if you're going to war, somebody has number go up, and you have feelings. Good luck.
Well, I mean, this kind of answers my next question, but when I went to Miami, I noticed that there were women, but not a lot of women. And the message is clearly not really getting across. And my generation really has so much of the spending power, at least in the US. So, what do you think would make that group understand the principles of Bitcoin? I'm assuming your answer is going to be something about number go up, but I think my generation craves this sense of authenticity, and we're all about oversharing on social media. What's going to translate the message, the principles of economics and Bitcoin to them?
Mm-hmm. I honestly don't know. I have to admit, yeah, there is an element of underrepresentation of women in the Bitcoin space, but I think I don't really know. I don't know what's you're asking a man to figure out women at the end of the day, so that's not an easy question. I've hit everything that you've thrown at me out of the park, but telling me how to sort out what 3 billion women think is a little tough.
All right, all right. Well, I'm trying to do my part to help, so I appreciate you guys being welcoming to me. Last couple of questions, just threats to Bitcoin for the people that are watching that are sort of new or they're thinking about investing and they're just not sure. They're worried about, they have the FUD. They're worried about the climate change narratives in the mainstream media, but also just the idea of the governments coming in, like we saw in China with shutting down mining. We know that governments are jealous. Central banks are protective of their prerogative. and politicians don't want to give up their power. So, and the pandemic even gave governments more power. So if Bitcoin got too big, can we trust government not to come in and tax the heck out of it or try to shut down things like exchanges where people could access their money?
Potentially. I mean, we saw a shutdown of Chinese mining over the last couple of weeks. But I think, the Bitcoin network is enormously resilient. And I think in the Bitcoin standard, if you read the Bitcoin standard, you'll see just how difficult and practically impossible almost all of these kinds of attacks are. If their objective is to destroy Bitcoin, they can inconvenient Bitcoin, but destroying it is a completely different ball game. I think the main threat that people should be concerned about is their own Bitcoins and their own private keys. If you lose your private keys, you lose your Bitcoins. If you give your coins to somebody else, you give your private keys to somebody else, they can always take them. So really, that's what you should be paying attention to. Don't worry about all the FUD. Don't worry about all the fake stories about the FBI breaking a Bitcoin wallet. They didn't break Bitcoin's encryption, and Bitcoin's not boiling the oceans. And don't worry about all that stuff. Really, if I think, if people would don't spend any time reading about this until you've spent the equivalent time first thinking about your own private key security. That's how I'd put it.
One of the things I find really fascinating just learning more about you and reading your books is that your ideology really isn't dependent on Bitcoin. Like Bitcoin could fail and you wouldn't change how you think or how you orient your life. You would just probably substitute the hardest money available, which I'm assuming perhaps would be gold. So how would you describe sort of the guiding principles that you believe in of economics to someone who has no experience in economics? Because I would argue that the majority of the public that we're speaking to, if you're going to go on general news, you're speaking to someone who has no finance or economics background. So how would you describe your guiding principles to someone that they should go with hard money?
I think, there's the general point that I think the market should get to choose. And I've explained why I think that's the case, because everything the market chooses works out better. There's also the case of the why hard money, because it's better at holding on for its value. But in general, I think, my larger viewpoint is, or my larger perspective on life is very libertarian and anarchist, in fact, and then believes ultimately the idea is that as a human being, you have to take charge of yourself. You are the only one looking out for yourself, and you need to you need to be the one who figures out how life goes for you. And of course, it doesn't mean that you don't live in a society. You live in a society, but you deal with people on a consensual basis. You agree with people to deal with them on terms that are agreeable for both. And I think in my mind, honestly, I think it's just healthy adulthood. It's not so much of a political ideology. It's just normal personal growth. If you're a child, you don't understand your boundaries and the boundaries between yourself and the others, and you expect others to do things for you, and you feel obliged to do things for others, and you get manipulated by others, and you're manipulating others. And a lot of people get stuck in this for all the rest of their life. And I think personal growth, an enormous part of personal growth, is being able to reach that point where you don't expect anything from anybody unless they've signed a contract with you to deliver that thing for you, basically. And I think living your life like that, you have to give up on a lot of illusions, but it's enormously liberating because you're not constantly disappointed by all these illusions. And so all these disappointments hits you, all these disappointments come to people who are, emotionally attached to them. A lot of people tie their entire identity and their happiness to political outcomes. And, if it's going to be this team or that team that's going to win the election. And it doesn't work as a path to happiness or growth or success in my mind, because you will only find that yourself if you're able to deliver it and build it yourself. So in my mind, my view of libertarianism and anarchism is just the idea that I seek to control my own self only. I don't seek to control anybody else, and I don't want anybody else to control me. And I think this is This is so incredibly hard. Controlling yourself is the hardest thing in the world. And of course, I think it's an astute observation to notice that the people who want to control others always have a lot of trouble controlling themselves. And in many obvious ways, you see it with the congressmen who are constantly getting stuck in all kinds of scandals. You see it in all kinds of people who have that mentality where they need to go and tell others what to do. They only think it's easy to control others because they haven't even tried to control themselves. And so when instead of trying to control themselves, failing and coming to their coming to the realization of how hard it is to act out according to what you willed, no, it's much easier to just demand others do things and then act out against them for not delivering them for you. So um, this is ultimately how I see it, and I think it's just the only way to live in life. I think, and it's not something that is contingent on convincing other people. So I'm not a political campaigner, and I'm not out there trying to get people to agree with me or to vote in a certain way. I'd like to live around people like this, but I do that by myself. Associating with people like that, I don't want to associate with people who are essentially collectivists and seek to control you. And I think, from my experience and from the experience of others I know, people who try and live like this end up being much happier and more productive because they're focused on what they can control.
Well, in the spirit of the idea of number go up to get more people in, what is it going to take to get us back to the 50s and 60s we saw earlier this year? There's so much FUD. What do you think it'll take for the number to go up and get more people into the space?
I honestly think it's just a matter of time. There's only going to be more and more dollars made, and there's less and less and less Bitcoin made over time. This can only go in one way. It might, we may see 65,000 this year, or maybe next year, maybe 5 years from now. But I have no doubt that we'll see it eventually.
So I know that you've been a big subscriber to the stock to flow model. Do you think that we're in danger of potentially diverging from that?
Could be, but I think it's still very, very early. I think people don't quite get what this model is saying. So the models just left the first standard deviation range for the first time since what is it? I think it was March 2019. So the notion that it has to always stay within one standard deviation is ridiculous. Um, the standard deviation is supposed to be one standard deviation range around it. If you go to the stock to flow multiple Twitter handle, the one standard deviation range around it is the range where 67% of observations should be there. But in fact, over the last 2 years, it's 100% of observations until the last week. So the fact that we are out of the one standard deviation range is essentially a trivial rounding error in the accuracy of the model overall, because with the model, with the two standard deviation range is 95% of observations. One standard deviation range is 67% of observations. So we've only been to the second standard deviation area for the first time in about 2 years and a few months. So I think it's very early to be calling it dead, and we've only been outside the two standard deviation areas since January 2014. That's 7.5 years. So for 7.5 years, this model has not been more than two standard deviations outside of the predicted range, which is pretty insane. And it's an enormous amount of accuracy. So in order for me to think that it's been rejected, it'd have to spend several months outside the two standard deviation range. And the longer it stays outside the two standard deviation range, the more inaccurate it is. I think it's out of the one standard deviation now, but I think over time, I still think this model is probably capturing something pretty accurate because of the way that Bitcoin works.
Well, it's surprising to me that more institutions are not getting into it, especially even on this dip with all the money printing happening. It seems like the primary allocation remains government debt and inflated assets, not even gold. And as a former gold bug, like, why do you think that is?
Gold has underperformed lumber and copper and all kinds of things. I think it must have been a pretty depressing year for gold bugs. It's I think the reality is that gold is I think, and this is what I came to the realization of in the fiat standard. Ultimately, what gave fiat its monetary role is the fact that fiat is more saleable across space than gold. That you can send fiat across the world much faster and cheaper than you can send gold. And I think ultimately, gold, without government rails, without government allowing central banks to perform final clearance with gold, gold is has very low salability across space, and so it's non-workable as money in the modern economy. And I think by by just banning gold clearance, governments have destroyed much of its monetary role. So now it's like an industrial metal, and it doesn't accrue value. And I think it's on the path of being demonetized, which I believe has already happened to silver.
Peter Schiff won't like to hear that, although I think he's done a lot for the adoption of Bitcoin.
Yeah,
um,
it's true.
I'm going to ask one last question. I'm just kind of curious, when I learn about Austrian economics, there's so much that seems to encourage sort of the best of us. This sort of, I've heard speeches on Bitcoin and how it promotes morality and sort of brings out the best of civilization. And there's so much hope in Bitcoin, right? That's one of the things that I love about the community is they're almost trying to sell the idea of hope and equality again in a very rigged, unfair system based on debt. Do you find that it's part of your mission to help translate and spread that message to people? Do you feel like it's part of your mission to make the world a better place through Bitcoin?
I think so, absolutely. I think I've found my what is that word? Japanese word, ikigai. I've definitely found my ikigai in Bitcoin, which is a mixture of something that you do because you enjoy it and because the world wants it and because it has meaning and because it provides you with an income. And I think it's a very good thing to have it. And I think, yeah, I think the world has really suffered a lot over the last 100 years because of the destruction of sound money. And there's been a lot of horror and suffering in the last year. It's unconscionable. It's shocking to even think about it. You know how many hundreds of millions of people have been murdered, and how many lives have been destroyed, and how many people have been impoverished, and how much more prosperous the world could have been if we'd had a proper money instead of this abomination that is being devalued at 10, 15, 50% a year, depending on where you got born. Um, I think, once you see it that way, it's hard to think about other things. And I think, yeah, I am motivated to continuously talk about this and to do it because if it helps bring about the end of easy money one day, if everything I do all my life gives us 1 hour less of easy money for humanity, I think it'll be worthwhile. It'll be a life that would have been worth living.
That's awesome. I love it. Especially because, you can be very salty on Twitter, but really you want to make the world a better place. Thank you so much, Saifedean, for all of your time. Just real quick for the people watching, how can they find you? What's the best ways for people to follow your work and what you have to say?
My website, saifedean.com. If you go to my website, you can find my book, and you can sign up for a membership to join my online educational forum platform. I've got already 4 online courses on Austrian economics that you can take, and we have 2 lively seminars that you could join as well. I also have a Kickstarter currently going for the Fiat standard, and you can also find it on my website if you just go to saifedean.com/Kickstarter. And you can pre-order the Fiat standard now so that you would get it by December. And You can also, by subscribing to my website, you'll get chapters, weekly chapters from the Fiat Standard and the Principles of Economics. Well, now we just finished the Fiat Standard, but Principles of Economics is going to be, you're going to be getting the next chapters of it coming over the forthcoming weeks. And yeah, Saifedean.com is the website. And I'm also on Twitter at Saifedean.
Great. Yeah, everybody needs to read these books, Bitcoin Standard, Fiat Standard. My family's reading this in Polish right now. And by the way, when you're not writing these books, what are you doing in your free time?
Well, to be perfectly honest, the last couple of years I've not had much free time because of writing those two books. But I also have a family and two kids, and that takes up a lot of my time. And I grill a lot of meat, and I play football sometimes. And that's basically it.
Football and meat. I love it. Thanks so much, Safe.
Cheers. Thank you very much, Natalie. This was a lot of fun.